The day Naya Chaska arrived in Pine Hollow, the wind kicked up so much dust it seemed the desert itself wanted to erase the road leading into town. They say in the West, there are two kinds of arrivals: those of men chasing fortune, and those of people just trying to survive. Naya's was the second. The wagon came to a stop with a long creak of tired wood. The driver, Otis Crow, pulled the reins and looked toward the small town as if it were the end of the world. "Road ends here," he grunted. Naya stepped down slowly. Her boots touched the red earth, dry as an old bone. In her hand she carried a small suitcase, so worn it looked like it had traveled farther than she had. Otis Crow asked no questions. He wished her no luck. He didn't even wait for her to fully step aside. He clicked his tongue, turned the wagon, and rode off, leaving behind a cloud of dust that swallowed the road. Naya was alone. In front of her stood Pine Hollow, a small town wedged between harsh mountains and wind-twisted pines. The wooden facades were faded by the sun. A dog slept beneath a wagon wheel. Somewhere the sound of a blacksmith's hammer striking iron echoed. And, as always happens in western towns, the stairs came before the words. 3 men leaning against a railing stopped talking. An old man sitting in front of the saloon lifted his eyes. A woman sweeping a porch paused mid-motion. All of them watched the newcomer. Naya took a deep breath. The air smelled of dust, old wood, and strong coffee. She pulled a letter from her pocket, folded many times. The paper was wrinkled, but the words were still clear. It promised work. It promised lodging. It promised a beginning. Following the directions written in the letter, she walked down the main street until she reached a boarding house. The building was old, but solid. A crooked sign hung above the door. Naya climbed the steps. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Silence. Then she saw the paper nailed to the wood with a rusted nail. "Closed for repairs." Nothing more. Naya read the note twice, as if the words might change if she stared long enough. But they didn't. The wind rattled the paper with a dry crackle. In that moment, she understood something very simple and very hard. She had nowhere to sleep, and she had no money. Hunger came like a quiet animal in her stomach. She hadn't eaten since dawn. Her eyes swept the street again. That's when she saw the general store. A wide building with 2 large windows filled with sacks of flour, jars of sugar, and tools. The sign read, "Pike, Provisions and Supplies." Naya walked to the door. When she stepped inside, a bell rang with a sharp chime. The interior smelled of tobacco, leather, and dried beans. Behind the counter stood a heavy-set man with suspenders over his shirt. His gaze carried the hardness of someone who had spent too many years dealing with debtors. It was Harlan Pike. Near a barrel of pickles stood 3 town men: Jed Turner, Silas Boone, Grant Holloway. All 3 turned at the same time when Naya entered. Silence dropped like a stone. Harlan Pike looked her over slowly from head to toe. The worn fabric of her dress, the dust of the road on her boots, the old suitcase. "Well," he said at last, "looks like Pine Hollow's got itself a visitor today." Jed Turner let out a short laugh. Naya stepped toward the counter. "I'm looking for work," she said calmly. "But today I only need a little flour. And salt. I can pay once I find a job." The laughter came quickly. Silas Boone shook his head. Grant Holloway crossed his arms. Harlan Pike placed both hands on the counter. "And what exactly do you plan to pay with?" Naya hesitated for a moment. Then she slipped her hand into the pocket of her dress. She pulled out a small silver locket. She set it on the wood. "This belonged to my mother," she said. Until I can pay. Harlan Pike picked it up between his thick fingers. He turned it under the light. Then he let out a loud laugh. Girl, this ain't worth half a sack of flour. Laughter filled the store. Naya felt the heat rise up her neck. But she didn't lower her gaze, just as she reached out her hand to take back the locket. Heavy boots echoed against the wooden floor. Slow. Steady. Someone stepped out of the shadows at the back of the store. A tall man with a dark hat and gray eyes like a stormy sky. Silence returned all at once. It was Cole Maddox, the mountain cowboy. He pulled out a small leather pouch and dropped several silver coins onto the counter. The metallic sound cut through the air. Give her what she asked for. His voice was low, but no one hesitated to obey. And in that moment, without knowing it, Naya Chaska's life was about to change forever. If this story has already sparked your curiosity, and you want to know what will happen when Naya Chaska and Cole Maddox leave that town for the mountains, subscribe right now and join us in the next chapters, because what comes next in Pine Hollow is a story of pride, storms, and second chances that no one in that town will ever forget. For a few seconds, no one moved inside the store. The silver coins still vibrated softly on the wooden counter, as if even the metal knew something important had just happened. Harlan Pike looked at the coins. Then he looked at the man who had placed them there, Cole Maddox. In Pine Hollow, everyone knew that name, not because he talked much, but precisely because he didn't. He was the kind of man who lived in the mountains, far from the noise of town, working hard, appearing only when he needed supplies, and disappearing again. Jed Turner cleared his throat. Well, he muttered. Looks like someone's got herself a protector. Silas Boone let out a small, uneasy laugh, but no one followed. Because Cole Maddox was still there, unmoving, his eyes fixed on Harlan Pike. Flour, salt, and some dried meat, he repeated calmly. There was no threat in his voice, but there was no room for argument either. Harlan Pike clenched his jaw. For a moment it looked like he was going to say something else, something that would bring the laughter back into the store. But he didn't. He grabbed a small sack of flour, then a packet of salt, then added strips of dried meat wrapped in paper. He set them on the counter with rough movements. Here. Cole pushed the coins toward him. Keep the change. Naya Chaska was still standing there, feeling the tension fill the air like the moment before a storm. She picked up the silver locket and slipped it back into her pocket. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from pride. Naya lifted the sack of supplies. Thank you, she said quietly. Cole Maddox didn't respond. He only gave a slight nod, as if it were nothing important. But to Naya, it was. When they stepped outside, the air felt cooler. The afternoon sun cast a golden light over Pine Hollow, stretching the shadows of the wooden buildings. A dark horse waited tied to the post in front of the store. Strong, muscular, with the quiet patience of an animal used to long roads. Cole untied the reins. Then he looked at Naya carefully for the first time. Where are you from? From the south, she answered. Cole nodded slowly. His gray eyes seemed capable of reading stories people didn't tell. Got family here? Naya shook her head. No. Silence returned between them, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. The wind carried dust along the street while a few people watched from a distance. Pine Hollow wasn't a place where many new things happened, and the arrival of an Apache woman with a solitary cowboy was definitely something new. Cole rested a hand on the saddle. Got somewhere to stay tonight? Naya glanced toward the road where Otis Crow's wagon had disappeared. The memory of the closed door came back to her. No. Cole looked at the town for a few seconds, then back at her. I've got a cabin up in the mountains. Naya said nothing. Cole continued. There's land, a small garden, or what's left of one. If you know how to work the land, you can stay there. Naya felt a strange mix of surprise and caution. Why would you do that for me? Cole shrugged slightly. Because someone should. It wasn't an elegant answer, but it was honest. The wind blew again between the buildings of the town. Naya thought about the laughter inside the store. She thought about the closed door of the boarding house. She thought about the long road she had traveled to get there. She didn't have many options. But something in Cole Maddox's calm voice told her that this man did not speak lightly. I can work, she said at last. Cole nodded. Good. He adjusted the saddle. Then get on. Naya hesitated for a moment. And you? I'll walk. She shook her head. I can walk too. Cole looked at her for a second, and a faint shadow of a smile appeared on his face. It's a long road. At last, Naya climbed onto the horse. Cole took the reins and started walking along the trail leading out of town. Behind them, Pine Hollow watched. In the doorway of his store, Harlan Pike was still staring. Jed Turner spat on the ground. That's strange. Silas Boone crossed his arms. Very strange. Grant Holloway frowned. That cowboy never brings people up to the mountains. Meanwhile, the town faded behind them. The trail climbed slowly through tall pines and ancient rocks. The sun began to sink behind the mountains. Naya looked ahead, where Cole Maddox walked with steady steps. She didn't know what she would find at that cabin. She didn't know how much that road would change her life. But something inside her, something strong and quiet like the mountains, told her that this was the beginning of something Pine Hollow would never forget. And as the evening wind moved through the trees, Naya Chaska left the town behind, never imagining that fate was leading her exactly where she was meant to be. The trail that led out of Pine Hollow was narrow, rocky, and silent, as if it had been carved by people who didn't want to be found easily. With every step they took, the town grew farther behind them, reduced to a few smoking chimneys in the golden light of dusk. Naya Chaska sat atop Cole Maddox's dark horse, holding carefully to the saddle. The animal moved with steady confidence, used to mountain paths. Cole walked beside it, holding the reins with a calmness that seemed natural to him. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the tall pines, creating a constant whisper that sounded like old mountain stories. Naya watched the landscape. The hills rose like sleeping giants. Gray rocks dotted the ground, and the scent of pine resin filled the cool air. It was a hard place, but a beautiful one. After a while, Naya broke the silence. Do you live out here alone? Cole Maddox kept walking without changing his pace. For years. His voice was calm, dry as desert earth. Don't you have family in town? Cole took a few seconds before answering. I did. Nothing more. But that short answer said more than it seemed. Naya didn't press. She had learned since childhood that some stories belong to silence. The path began to climb more steeply. The horse snorted softly as it moved between rocks and roots. Cole stopped. Get down for a moment, he said. Naya slid her legs off and touched the ground again. The air up there was colder. Cole adjusted the saddle and looked toward the top of the trail. We're close. They climbed the last stretch together on foot. The sky was beginning to change color, shifting from gold to the deep blue of evening. Then, as they rounded a small bend in the path, the cabin appeared. It was small, built from thick pine logs darkened by time. The roof was covered with old boards, and a stone chimney let out a thin line of smoke. Around it stood a worn wooden fence enclosing uneven ground, what had once been a garden. Now it was filled with wild weeds and dry soil. Cole opened the small gate in the fence. "This is the place." Naya walked slowly around the land. The garden was neglected, yes, but not dead. Her attentive eyes saw it immediately. The planting rows could still be traced beneath the weeds. Some stones marked the edges of old beds. The soil, though dry on top, was still dark and moist a few inches below. Naya knelt and took a handful of earth between her fingers. She rubbed it gently. Then she looked up. This land can still give life. Cole watched her in silence. "If someone works it." Naya stood up. "I can do it." Cole nodded, as if he had already expected that answer. Then he opened the cabin door. The inside was simple, but clean. There was a thick wooden table, 2 sturdy chairs, and an iron stove in one corner. The smell of old coffee and burnt wood filled the air. On the mantel above the fireplace, there was a single photograph. A young woman with a calm smile. Naya looked at it for a few seconds. Cole noticed her gaze. "My sister." Naya turned her eyes toward him. "What was her name?" Cole took a moment before answering. "Lydia Maddox." The way he said her name carried respect and pain. Naya inclined her head slightly. "She was beautiful." Cole didn't respond, but his eyes softened just a little. Then he pointed to a small door at the back of the cabin. "There's a room in there." Naya opened the door. Inside was a simple bed, a small window, and a thick blanket neatly folded. Nothing more, but for someone who, just hours earlier, had nowhere to sleep, it felt like a gift. When she returned to the main room, Cole was making coffee. He handed her a metal cup. "We start early tomorrow." Naya blew on the hot coffee. "What needs to be done?" Cole gestured toward the outside. "The garden needs to come back to life." Then he added, "And the fence, too." Naya looked out the window at the land. Stars were beginning to appear above the dark mountains. In her mind, she could already imagine what the place would look like full of plants again. Rosemary, chamomile, mint. Herbs her Apache people had used for generations. A small smile appeared on her face. "Then tomorrow we work." Cole raised his cup. "Welcome to the mountain, Naya Chaska." The fire crackled in the stove as the night wind moved through the pines. And though neither of them knew it yet, in that small cabin lost among the mountains, something much bigger than simple work was beginning. A new story was being born, one that would soon change the fate of Pine Hollow, and everyone who lived there. Morning in the mountains came before the sun rose over the peaks. The air was cold, clean, and silent. A deep silence, different from the towns. Here there were no wagon wheels, no saloon doors swinging open, no voices of men arguing over money. Only the wind through the pines and the distant cry of a hawk. Naya Chaska opened her eyes when the first gray light came through the small window of the room. For a few seconds, she stayed still, listening to the sounds of the place. The cabin creaked softly with the change in temperature. From the other room came the sound of metal striking iron. Cole Maddox was already awake. Naya got up, washed her face with cold water from a basin, and stepped outside. The mountain was covered in a bluish light that signaled dawn. The air smelled of damp earth, wood, and smoke from the fire. Cole was by the fence, checking some loose boards with a hammer. He looked up when he saw Naya come out. "You're up early." Naya walked toward the garden. "The land doesn't wait." Cole rested the hammer against the fence post. "That's true." Both of them looked over the ground. Up close, the garden looked even more abandoned than Naya had thought the night before. The weeds grew tall, some nearly reaching the knee. The soil was hardened from months of neglect. But Naya saw something else. She knelt down and began to clear the weeds carefully. "This isn't dead," she said. Cole crossed his arms. "No. Just forgotten." Naya began to work. Her hands moved with patience, pulling deep roots and separating the stones that marked the old rows. Every movement was precise, as if she had known the place for years. Cole watched her from the fence. He had seen many people try to work the land, but there was something different in the way Naya touched the soil. She didn't treat it as something to conquer. She treated it as something to listen to. After a few minutes, Cole approached with a shovel. "If you're going to start, you might as well do it right." Naya looked up. "Then help me." Cole drove the shovel into the hard ground. The metal struck a hidden stone. "This will take time." "Everything worth it does." They worked for hours. The sun rose slowly over the mountains, lighting the land with a warm glow. Sweat began to run down Naya's forehead as she cleared piles of dry weeds. Her hands began to ache, but she didn't stop. In her mind, she remembered the teachings of the women of her Apache people. Her mother always said that the land recognizes those who care for it. By midday, the garden was already showing its first clean lines. Small furrows appeared where there had once been only weeds. Cole left the shovel leaning against a log and looked over the work. "I didn't think this would ever look like a garden again." Naya stood up, brushing the dust from her hands. "It will." Cole raised an eyebrow. "You that sure?" Naya looked at the land calmly. "I've seen worse land come back to life." The wind moved softly through the pine branches. Cole walked to the nearby well and pulled up a bucket of water. He handed it to her. Naya drank gratefully. The cold water ran down her throat like a mountain stream. "Thank you." Cole looked up at the sky. "If we're going to sell anything in town, we'll have to plant soon." "Rosemary," Naya said. Cole frowned. "Rosemary. It withstands the cold and the wind." Cole thought for a few seconds. "People in Pine Hollow buy a lot of rosemary." Naya smiled slightly. "Then that's where we'll start." For the rest of the afternoon, they kept working. Cole repaired the fence while Naya prepared the soil. As the sun went down, the garden began to change. It no longer looked like a forgotten place. It looked like a place waiting to begin again. When the sky turned shades of orange and red, Cole sat on the edge of the fence. He watched Naya pulling out the last roots of the day. "You work hard." Naya looked up. "I always have." Cole nodded slowly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Cole said something unexpected. "Most people would have left after what happened in the store." Naya went still. The memory of the laughter returned for a moment, but her voice was steady. "If I left every time someone laughed, I'd never get anywhere." Cole let out a short, dry laugh. "That's true." The sun disappeared behind the mountains. The garden, still unfinished, was filled with new lines, small beginnings. Cole stood up. "Tomorrow we plant." Naya looked over the land one more time. The dark soil reflected the last light of the day. Yes, tomorrow would be the real first day of something new. And though the town of Pine Hollow didn't know it yet, something was beginning to grow on that small mountain that would change many things. The next morning arrived with a golden light that slowly slid over the mountain slopes. The air was fresh, clear, carrying that deep scent of earth that only appears when a place is ready to begin again. Naya Chaska was already awake when the sun touched the edge of the pines. She had gone outside before dawn. Standing in the middle of the freshly cleared garden, she looked at the dark soil they had prepared the day before. The rows were still uneven, but now the land had shape, had order. It seemed to breathe again. Naya held a small cloth bag in her hands. Inside were the first seeds she had found in an old jar inside the cabin. Rosemary, a strong, resilient plant, capable of growing even where wind and drought punish the land. She heard footsteps behind her. Cole Maddox approached from the cabin, carrying a cup of hot coffee. "Didn't think anyone could wake up earlier than me," he said in a calm voice. Naya smiled faintly. The land works best when it's still cool. Cole looked at the prepared rows. His gray eyes moved across the garden with a mix of surprise and respect. Yesterday, this looked like a dead field. Today it doesn't, Naya replied. Cole took a sip of coffee, then pointed to the cloth bag. "What are we planting first?" Naya opened the bag and let a few seeds fall into her palm. Rosemary. Cole nodded. Good choice. He knelt beside one of the furrows and began digging small holes with the tip of his knife. For a while, they worked in silence. The wind moved the pine branches above their heads, creating a soft, steady sound. A pair of hawks circled high over the valley. The mountain was calm. Naya placed each seed carefully, covering it with soil as if she were tucking away something valuable. Cole noticed that gesture. You treat every seed like it matters. Naya kept working as she replied. Because it does. Cole smiled faintly. For most people, this is just a business. For my people, plants are life. Cole didn't ask more. But he listened. They kept working for hours. The sun climbed slowly until it stood above the mountains. The heat began to settle over the freshly turned soil. When they finished the first row of rosemary, the garden already looked different. Small furrows filled with promise. Cole stood up and stretched his back. With any luck, we'll see sprouts in a few weeks. Naya looked at the soil. We will. Cole rested his hands on the wooden fence and looked out over the valley. From there, Pine Hollow could be seen as a small point in the dusty distance. People in town buy rosemary for cooking, he said. It's also used for healing, Naya added. Cole raised an eyebrow. Healing? Aches, fever, small wounds? Cole looked at the garden again. Then we're not just selling herbs. No. Naya stood up slowly. We're growing something people need. The wind picked up for a few seconds, stirring dust between the trees. Cole watched Naya with a thoughtful expression. There was something in her determination that reminded him of someone. Someone who had also believed the land could change things. But he said nothing. Instead, he took a bucket of water from the well and began watering the newly planted rows. The water seeped slowly into the dark soil. Naya watched the moisture spread among the seeds. That was the most important moment, because planting was only the beginning. The real work was caring for what came after. When they finished watering, both of them sat on the fence. The garden in front of them looked quiet, almost modest. But Naya knew what it meant. A beginning. Cole broke the silence. When these plants grow, we'll head down to town and sell them. Naya looked toward Pine Hollow in the distance. She remembered the laughter. She remembered the sound of the locket hitting the counter. But this time, her expression was different. There was no shame, only determination. "Then we'll go," she said. Cole nodded slowly. The sun was already high when they returned to work. There were more rows to prepare, more seeds to plant. And though the garden still seemed small against the vastness of the mountain, every seed buried in that soil carried a quiet promise. A promise of growth, a promise of change. And somewhere, very soon, Pine Hollow would discover that something new was beginning to grow in the mountains. Something that neither the laughter of the past nor the pride of the town could stop. The weeks passed in the mountains without anyone in Pine Hollow noticing what was changing up there. But the land noticed. Every morning, before the sun touched the tops of the pines, Naya Chaska was already in the garden. The air was cool, almost cold, and a light mist hovered over the ground like a quiet veil. The garden that once looked abandoned now had order. The rows were aligned. The soil was loose. The first green leaves were beginning to break through the surface. Small rosemary sprouts pushed up bravely through the dark earth. Naya knelt beside one of them. With careful fingers, she brushed away a small mound of soil so the plant could receive more light. "Grow strong," she murmured softly. For Naya, caring for the plants was not just work. It was something deeper, something she had learned since childhood in the lands of her Apache people. Plants listen. Plants respond. They only need patience. From the nearby fence, Cole Maddox watched. He held a cup of coffee in one hand and rested his other arm on the wooden post. For days, he had watched the same scene repeat itself. Naya working. Naya talking to the land. Naya treating every plant as if it mattered. At last, he spoke. "I've never seen anyone work a garden like that." Naya looked up. "How?" Cole walked towards the garden. "As if the plants were people." Naya smiled faintly. "Maybe they're not people, but they act like they're listening." Cole let out a short, dry laugh. "If they start answering, then I'll worry." Naya went back to work. "They will." "Oh yeah? When they grow." Cole fell silent for a moment. There was something calming about those mornings. No noise, no weight of Pine Hollow. Just the wind, the open sky, and the soft sound of the earth being worked. That day, they decided to plant mint in one corner of the garden near the shade of the fence. Mint needed less sun, but more water. As they dug the new furrows, Cole spoke suddenly. "My sister used to take care of this garden, too." Naya lifted her head. "Lydia Maddox?" Cole nodded. She liked flowers more than herbs. He paused for a moment, looking at the ground. She said the mountain was too serious, and that it needed color. Naya imagined the garden filled with flowers. "What happened to her?" The wind moved softly through the trees. Cole took a few seconds before answering. "Fever came one winter." Naya said nothing. In the West, people understood what that meant. Illness traveled fast in those days, and medicine often arrived too late. Cole drove the shovel into the ground with a firm strike. After that, the garden stayed like this. Naya looked around. Now she understood. That place hadn't been abandoned out of laziness. It had been abandoned out of grief. She stepped closer to one of the small rosemary plants beginning to grow. "Your sister would be happy to see this." Cole didn't answer, but his eyes softened slightly. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The plants shone with a fresh green under the light. At midday, Naya filled a small bucket with water from the well and began watering the young sprouts. Cole sat on the fence. "When these plants grow, people in town are going to want to buy them." "I hope so." Cole crossed his arms. "Especially Martha Doyle. She's always looking for good herbs." Naya remembered the name. "She's the woman who sells bread at the market?" "That's the one." Naya nodded. "Then we'll have something to offer." Cole looked at the garden again. "You know, when I brought you here, I thought maybe you'd stay a few days." Naya kept watering calmly. "And now?" Cole looked at the green rose growing slowly. "Now I think this place needed you." Naya looked up. "Maybe we needed this place." The wind moved the young rosemary leaves, small plants just beginning, but already strong. Cole looked at Naya with a calm expression. For a long time, he had lived alone in the mountains, but for the first time in years, that place no longer felt empty. There was life in the garden. There was conversation in the cabin. There were footsteps on the ground in the mornings. And though neither of them said it out loud, they both knew it. The mountain was changing, and with it, so were they. Summer had quietly advanced over the mountain. What had once been forgotten land now breathed with life. The garden in front of Cole Maddox's cabin was full of green shades and fresh scents. The rosemary plants stood firm under the sun. The mint grew thick along the fence, and small chamomile sprouts began to open their white flowers like tiny stars over the dark soil. Naya Chaska walked between the rows of plants with a wicker basket on her arm. With soft, precise movements, she cut the strongest rosemary branches, forming small bundles tied with thin thread. Each one was clean, neat, and fragrant. The air was filled with that deep, refreshing scent that only rosemary can offer. From the fence, Cole watched her work. "Looks like the mountain decided to help us," he said. Naya lifted a bundle and brought it close to her nose. "The land responds when it's treated well." Cole nodded slowly. For weeks they had worked without rest. They had watered every morning, protected the plants from strong winds, and pulled out the weeds that tried to return. Now the garden was finally ready to offer something. "Today we go down to town," Cole said. Naya lifted her gaze towards the distant valley where Pine Hollow lay. It had been a long time since she had last been there. The memory of the laughter in Harlan Pike's store was still in her mind, though now it felt different. Not like a wound, but like a reason. Cole began loading a small wagon with baskets full of herbs. "If we're going to sell this, it needs to look good." Naya arranged the bundles carefully. "People buy with their eyes first." Cole smiled slightly, and then with their nose. When the sun rose higher, they set off toward town. The road sloped gently down between pines and rocks. The horse moved steadily, pulling the light wagon. Along the way, the wind carried the scent of warm earth and dry leaves. Naya watched the landscape in silence. Cole noticed her expression. "You worried?" "No." "Then you're thinking?" Naya nodded. "I'm thinking about how different it feels to come back." Cole looked at the road. "The town doesn't change much. People do." Cole didn't answer, but he seemed to agree. When they finally reached Pine Hollow, the place was full of activity. It was market day. Wagons loaded with vegetables and fruit filled the main street. Children ran between the stalls while vendors shouted out prices. the smell of fresh bread mixed with roasted meat and strong coffee. Cole stopped the wagon near the central well. "This will do." Naya climbed down and began setting up their small stand. She spread a clean cloth over the wooden table and placed the rosemary bundles in neat rows. Then she arranged the mint and small packets of dried chamomile. The herbs shone with a deep green under the sunlight. For a few minutes, no one approached. People passed by, glanced with curiosity, and kept walking. Naya remained calm. Patience was part of the work. Then a familiar voice sounded nearby. "Well now, what do we have here?" A gray-haired woman stepped up to the stand. It was Martha Doyle, known in town for her bakery. She picked up a bundle of rosemary and brought it to her nose. Her eyebrows lifted immediately. "Well, I'll be—" Naya watched her closely. Martha smelled the rosemary again. "This is strong, fresh, very fresh." She looked at Naya. "Where'd you grow this?" "In the mountains." Martha Doyle nodded slowly. "It shows." She pulled out a small pouch of coins. "I'll take 3 bundles." The sound of metal hit the table. It was the first sale. Cole crossed his arms behind her, watching with a faint smile. After Martha, another woman stepped forward. Then a man. Then another woman. The scent of the herbs began to draw more people in. "How much is it?" "Got any mint, too?" "That rosemary smells better than the stores." Coins began to pile up on the table. The small stand no longer looked ignored. It had become one of the busiest in the market. From the doorway of his store, Harlan Pike watched everything. His expression was serious. He had recognized Naya the moment she arrived. He had also recognized the rosemary, the very same rosemary he had dismissed months before. Jed Turner appeared beside him. "Looks like the Apache woman found herself some work." Harlan Pike said nothing. Silas Boone was also watching from the boardwalk. "And looks like she's doing it well." The market continued to grow around the stand. Meanwhile, Naya Chaska kept selling calmly. But deep down, she knew something more was happening. It wasn't just a day of sales. It was the moment Pine Hollow began to realize that the woman who had arrived with nothing had come back with something the town hadn't expected. Respect. Success at the market changed many things, but not everything. When Naya Chaska and Cole Maddox returned to the mountain that afternoon, the wagon was almost empty. The rosemary bundles had disappeared one by one, and the bag of coins weighed much more than when they had left that morning. The horse moved slowly along the road back, kicking up small clouds of dust. The sun was beginning to sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in warm, quiet tones. Cole broke the silence. "Not bad for a first day?" Naya held the bag of coins in her hands. "The people in town need these plants." "People in town need a lot of things," Cole replied. Naya looked at the road for a few seconds. "But they don't always know where to find them." Cole smiled slightly. When they reached the cabin, the mountain air was cool and still. The garden greeted them with the familiar scent of rosemary and mint, gently stirred by the wind through the plants. Naya walked calmly between the rows. The plants were stronger every day. Some new branches were already beginning to grow where before there had only been bare soil. "Soon we'll have more to sell," she said. Cole leaned the wagon against the fence. "I hope so, because once Pine Hollow tastes something good, it'll want more." Naya nodded, but as they spoke, something caught her attention. On the distant horizon, above the highest mountains, the sky was beginning to change. Clouds appeared slowly and thick, like a gray wall moving in from the north. Naya frowned slightly. "That wasn't there this morning." Cole looked in the same direction. For a few seconds he said nothing. The wind shifted. Now it blew colder. "Storm," he said at last. Naya watched the clouds again. In the mountains, storms could appear without warning and disappear just as quickly. But some didn't. Some came with force. Cole walked toward the garden. "If it rains hard, the water will come down that side of the hill." He pointed to the lower part of the land, where the youngest rows had been planted. "That's where it hits first." Naya walked over and studied the ground. The soil was still loose from their recent work. If the water came hard, it could wash away the smallest plants. Naya ran her hand over one of the young sprouts. "They're still fragile." Cole crossed his arms. "The mountain decides a lot of things up here." Naya looked at the clouds again. The wind picked up, moving the pine branches with a deep sound. "But we can help." Cole raised an eyebrow. "How?" Naya bent down and lifted a stone from the edge of the garden. "If we build a barrier here, the water will split." Cole studied the land. Then he looked at the natural line where the water would run. Then back at Naya. "That might work." The first thunder sounded far away, barely a murmur in the sky. Cole grabbed a shovel. "Then we'd better start now." Naya began gathering stones around the garden. For the next hour they worked quickly. The clouds covered more and more of the sky, and the light of the evening slowly disappeared behind the approaching storm. The stones now formed a small defensive line along the lowest edge of the garden. Nothing big, but enough to divert the water. The wind grew stronger. The rosemary leaves moved rapidly. Naya paused for a moment and looked at the garden. The plants they had cared for over weeks stood there, small but brave. Cole stepped closer. "We did what we could." The sky darkened even more. A flash of lightning briefly lit the distant mountains. Naya took a deep breath. "Sometimes that's enough." The first loud thunder followed seconds later. The storm was close. Cole picked up the tools and walked toward the cabin. "We'd better get inside." Naya gave the garden one last look. The wind pushed the plants hard, as if the mountain itself were testing their strength. Then she followed Cole to the door. When they closed it behind them, the first drops of rain began to fall on the wooden roof. At first, soft, then heavier. From the window, Naya watched the garden under the growing rain. The drops struck the freshly worked soil. The wind pushed the plants from side to side. But the small stone barrier held firm. Cole leaned beside the window. "Tomorrow we'll see if the garden held." Naya kept her eyes on the plants, struggling under the storm. "It will." But deep down, she knew that night would not be easy. Because in the mountains, storms don't just test the strength of the land. They also test the strength of those who choose to stay on it. The storm lasted all night. The wind battered the cabin with furious gusts, as if it wanted to tear it from the mountain. The rain fell heavy and constant, pounding against the wooden roof and rushing down the slopes with the sound of an uncontrolled river. Inside the cabin, Naya Chaska barely slept. Every thunderclap shook the windows. Every gust of wind reminded her of the garden they had worked so hard to build. Cole Maddox remained seated near the window, watching the darkness. "Storms here usually pass quickly," he said quietly. But this didn't feel like just any storm. The rain continued almost until dawn. When the sky finally began to lighten, silence slowly returned to the mountain. The wind calmed, and the sound of the rain softened into a gentle dripping from the pines. Naya was the first to rise. She opened the cabin door. The cold morning air rushed in, clean and damp. The sky was covered with gray clouds, but the storm had already moved east. Naya stepped outside quickly. The ground was soaked. Small streams still ran down the slope of the mountain. But her eyes weren't searching the landscape. They were searching for the garden. Cole stepped out behind her. Both of them walked to the fence without a word. For a moment, neither spoke. The garden was still there. The small stone barrier had diverted most of the water to one side of the land. The rows were wet, but not destroyed. The rosemary plants leaned slightly under the weight of the rain. But they were still standing. Naya let out a long breath. They made it. Cole studied the plants carefully. Stronger than we thought. Naya walked between the rows, gently lifting some of the branches bent by the storm. She shook the excess water from the leaves. The plants were still alive. That was what mattered. But then they heard a different sound. A dull thud, then another. Cole lifted his head. You hear that? The sound came again. Clearer this time, the creak of wood, followed by the noise of something heavy dragging along the path. Both of them turned toward the trail leading up from the valley. Between the trees, a wagon appeared. It moved slowly, leaning to one side. One of its wheels was clearly damaged, crooked and nearly broken. The horse pulling it struggled with each step. Beside it walked a man. When he came close enough, Naya recognized him. It was Harlan Pike. His hat was soaked, his coat covered in mud. He looked more worn than Naya remembered. The wagon moved a few more feet, until the damaged wheel finally gave way with a sharp crack. The wagon lurched hard. The horse neighed nervously. Harlan Pike dropped the reins and looked at the broken wheel with frustration. Cole walked toward him without hurry. That wheel's not going much farther. Harlan Pike looked up. When he saw Cole Maddox, he sighed wearily. Yeah, I figured that. Then he saw Naya standing by the fence. For a moment, the silence was uncomfortable. Months earlier, that same man had laughed when she asked for food in his store. Now he stood there, with a broken wagon in the middle of the mountain. Cole crouched to inspect the damage. The axles split. Harlan Pike removed his hat, running a hand through his wet hair. The bridge down in the valley washed out in the storm, he said. Lost half my load trying to cross the creek. Naya looked at the broken wheel. The wood was completely splintered. Cole stood up. We'll have to replace the axle support. Harlan Pike hesitated for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out some coins. I can pay. Naya looked at him. She remembered the laughter. She remembered the silver locket on the counter. But something in the man's tired expression made her see the situation differently. Naya walked toward the wagon. She placed a hand on the broken wheel. No need to pay. Harlan Pike looked at her, surprised. Why? Naya lifted her gaze to meet his. Because when something breaks, someone has to fix it. Cole was already walking toward the shed to get tools. Harlan Pike remained silent for a moment. The woman he had mocked in his store was now helping him without asking for anything in return. The mountain wind moved softly through the pines, and for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Naya Chaska felt that the past no longer carried the same weight it once had. The sound of a hammer striking wood echoed softly among the pines. Cole Maddox worked with steady movements, fitting a new piece into the wagon's axle. Beside him, Harlan Pike held the lantern, while the cold morning wind moved across the mountain, still damp from the storm. Naya Chaska held the wheel steady. For several minutes, no one spoke. Only the sound of metal against wood, the creak of tools, and the wind descending from the mountains. At last, Cole gave a final strike. That should hold all the way back to town. He stood up and wiped his hands on his pants. Harlan Pike studied the repair. He ran a hand over the wheel, as if making sure it was truly fixed. Never thought I'd end up here, needing help, he muttered. Naya didn't respond. Cole gathered the tools as silence settled between the three of them. The sky began to open between the clouds. Rays of sunlight cut through the valley, lighting the garden spread out before the cabin. The rosemary plants shone with drops of rain still clinging to their leaves. Harlan Pike lifted his gaze towards the garden. That rosemary, he said slowly. It's the same you sold at the market. Naya nodded. Yes. Harlan Pike took a deep breath. His eyes moved across the garden. The neat rows, the living soil, the repaired fence. I never imagined anyone could get something like this out of this land. Naya looked at the plants with a calm expression. The land just needs someone who believes in it. The wind moved through the pine branches above them. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Harlan Pike removed his hat. The gesture was simple, but heavy. Naya, he said at last. She looked at him. I was wrong about you. The words came out awkwardly, as if he wasn't used to saying them. In the store, that day. Naya remembered the sound of laughter. She remembered the silver locket hitting the counter. But the memory no longer hurt the way it once had. Yes, she answered softly. Harlan Pike lowered his gaze. I shouldn't have done that. Cole watched in silence from the fence. He knew some men took a long time to say certain words, but when they finally did, it meant they had learned something. Naya walked to the wagon. She gently pushed the repaired wheel. You can head back to town before the road turns to mud again. Harlan Pike looked up. After all that, you're not going to say anything else? Naya thought for a moment. Then she shook her head. No. Harlan Pike frowned. Why? Naya looked at the garden once more. The plants moved softly in the breeze. Because I know what it feels like to be alone when no one wants to help you. The wind passed between them like a long sigh. Harlan Pike nodded slowly. He climbed onto the wagon. Before taking the reins, he looked at Naya one more time. If you ever need anything in Pine Hollow, Naya smiled faintly. I think we'll be just fine up here. Harlan Pike inclined his head. Then he flicked the reins lightly. The wagon began to descend the mountain path until it disappeared among the trees. Silence returned. Cole walked to the edge of the garden. He looked over the plants, the damp earth, the sky beginning to clear. You could have let him leave with that broken wheel. Naya stepped closer. Yes. Cole looked at her. Then why didn't you? Naya ran her hand gently along a rosemary branch. Because bitterness doesn't make anything grow. Cole let out a small smile. The sun finally broke through the clouds, lighting the entire garden with a warm glow. The air smelled of wet earth, rosemary, and fresh wood. For a long moment, both of them looked out over the valley. Pine Hollow seemed small from up there, but it no longer felt like a hostile place. Cole spoke in a calm voice. You know, when I first saw you in Harlan Pike's store, I thought you were just another traveler who'd disappear in a few days. Naya looked at him. And now? Cole gestured towards the garden. Now I think this place was always waiting for you. The wind moved softly through the pines. Naya touched the small silver locket hanging from her neck. It had survived the journey, the laughter, and time. Just like her. She looked at the garden. She looked at the mountain. Then she looked at Cole Maddox. For the first time since she arrived in Pine Hollow, she felt something deep and steady in her chest. It wasn't pride, it was belonging. A home is not always the place where we are born. Sometimes, it is the place where someone chooses to stay. And now, as the sun lit the mountains and the rosemary swayed in the wind, one question lingered in the air. If you had been Naya Chaska, after everything that happened in Pine Hollow, would you have chosen to leave, or would you have chosen to stay?